Okay, hello class. So I know it's been a while. I've been a little remiss in my lessons. But today we're going to have just a dynamite lesson on chapter 22. If you follow the lecture and study chapter 22, I guarantee you'll know more about economics, macroeconomics, than 90% of the people who call themselves economists on TV, okay? Most of those people are not economists anyway. I hope you realize that. Anyway, chapter 22, we're going to take what we've done in chapter 20 and 21, put it together, and derive all the mechanics you need to have a working model of the economy and be able to analyze all kinds of shocks to the economy. And we're going to take that into chapter 23, where we're going to look at how in detail how the Federal Reserve in particular can direct monetary policy to improve things. Okay, so chapter 22 goes through all the mechanics necessary to analyze an economy. And so in order to do that, we're going to develop and study three curves actually. One would be, where am I here? One would be the aggregate demand curve, which actually we did derive in chapter 21. So this is a little review. We'll have a little review. The book goes through a little review on aggregate demand curve. I don't know why it repeats itself, but it does. Then we're going to derive the aggregate supply curve, and this really is two curves. The long run supply curve and the short run aggregate supply curve. I forgot it. We'll see what letters they use in a minute. So when you put essentially these three curves on a graph, you'll be able to solve for equilibrium output and equilibrium inflation. Okay, the star stands for equilibrium. Pi here stands for inflation. And don't get this confused, this pi. There's another very important variable, pi to the e, which is expected inflation. Don't get those confused, okay? So these three curves, it's really two curves at any point in time, can determine two variables. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, if you put two curves on a graph, you can solve for two variables. And the two variables that the Federal Reserve is interested in is output, equilibrium output, and inflation. Okay. it's interesting to note that we don't really think that much about inflation these days, or at least the common man doesn't, and that's because inflation has been very low and stable, basically for the last 20 years. But before that, in particular, when I was your age, when I went to school, inflation then was a huge problem. It was, instead of today, it might be 1 or 2%. Back then, it was 10, 12%. And the problem with having what is inflation? Okay, so inflation is the price, the change in prices divided by the price, or the percentage change in prices. So if the average price goes from 100 today to 110 a year from now, that would be a 10% increase, and that would be an inflation rate of 10%. And the problem with having a significant inflation rate, more than a 1 or 2%, is that all prices don't increase at the same rate. And also, besides prices, we have, on the supply side, you have the percentage change in wages, and basically workers, can't keep buying things if you have inflation and their wages aren't increasing. So one of the big problems of having a significant inflation rate is that wages tend to lag behind. Increases in wages tend to lag behind increases in prices. And so back in the 70s, early 80s, people would go to the store, and every time they went to the store, certain prices had gone up. And it would be difficult to buy the same things you bought a year before, unless you had, unless your wages were going up at the same rate. And, in generally, the lag in increases in wages made things very uncomfortable for, working people who were, whose labor contracts, as it were not tied to inflation. Okay, and another group of people would be people who were retired. They lived on generally a fixed income. For example, it used to be people had pensions and some still do, pensions like if they worked for the government, they'd have a pension. It would be a nominal pension. It would be a certain dollar amount per month. If you had a significant inflation rate, the value of those pensions would fall every year. Okay, so they were not, and they still aren't indexed to the inflation rate. Nowadays, I don't remember when this started, but it became a big deal to adjust Social Security payments every year according to the increase in the price level into the inflation rate. So that's why, these are some of the reasons why, having lived through an experience like that in the 70s and early 80s, it was socially very disruptive, and the government has been very vigilant in guarding against a resurgence in a significant inflation rate. So, in a perfect world, all prices and wages would increase at the same rate, and if you had inflation, it wouldn't mean anything. But given these frictions and nominal contracts that aren't indexed to inflation, we don't live in that perfect world, so inflation can be a big problem, or is a big problem. So the government is going to try and control these two variables, output and inflation. And we're looking in Chapter 22 and a model that's going to allow them to do that. So, going now, why do I have this figure on the graph that I'm on the board that I'm not using? So, in Chapter 21, we looked at the derivation of the aggregate demand curve. So, just to review a tad, when we first looked at our model of the economy, we explained this relationship between investment and real interest rates. Okay, so I forgot which letters exactly, but investment would be some, I guess, let me back this up here a bit. I guess investment would be maybe I bar, okay, minus D times little r. Now, R is the real rate of interest. And this is one of the big equations in macroeconomics. Investment would be some constant amount, and it would be negatively related, have a negative relation to the real rate of interest, R. And that's easy to explain. The lower the rate of interest that a business has to pay on borrowing money to build a factory, the easier it is for them to make a profit. Okay, so this is one of the huge equations in macroeconomics. Okay, and then we introduced a monetary policy rule where the Federal Reserve Board would set the real rate of interest like this. It would have some constant real rate. We showed how that has many different autonomous factors that represents many or several autonomous factors, plus a function of the inflation rate. And so since E is a positive number, the higher inflation is, the higher the real rate of interest the Fed wants to set in the market. So, and the reason it does that, because if inflation starts to get high, the way that the Fed can reduce it is to increase the real rate of interest, and that will result in a fall in investment spending and output after that. So if you substitute this equation for monetary policy into the equation for investment, you're going to then substitute that into our aggregate demand equation. This is NX here. You're going to have Y is going to be, let's say, some constant K, and it's going to be negatively related to, so let's see, this is H, whatever, to real interest rates. You can see that the IS curve, or the investment curve, this real rate here, because of the monetary policy curve, becomes a function of the inflation rate. And so, whoops, I made a little mistake there. 1 second. This I should have written, sorry about that. This should be inflation. We're going to substitute this real rate equation into here. We're going to get a relation between income, investment and inflation, and when we put that in here into the aggregate demand equation, we're going to end up with this equation here. Income is a function of some constant minus a function of inflation. Okay. And that's why, and this will be this is your AD curve. Very good. Inflation, output, you have a negative relationship. That's why the curve slopes down. Okay? Out of all this, all you have to do is remember that inflation really is a stand-in for the real rate of interest, and as you lower real rates of interest, there's more demand in the economy. Okay. That's pretty easy to remember. Okay. And in fact, on page 517, this is from 517, and then they have this little schematic here. When inflation goes up, the real rate of interest goes up. Investment goes down. Aggregate demand goes down. Okay? So that would be, let's say that's the blue curve, okay? The initial one, the blue curve. So, whoops. Oh my God. Sorry about that. Oh my God. Oh my. If you breathe wrong on this thing, it starts to do things. Okay. So that's the blue curve, okay? So why do we have two curves here? this figure shows the effect of increasing or changing all the autonomous parts of this equation. Autonomous means that they're not dependent on any variables. Okay, they're given amounts. So, for example, consumption. You can imagine that consumption would be, even if you didn't have income, people would consume out of savings or whatever, or charity or borrowing, whatever. There would be a certain constant amount, and that constant amount plus a certain amount that depends on their income. So that constant amount, there would be a certain constant amount. There would each of these terms would have a certain constant amount as part of their part of the term. So investment might be a certain constant amount that doesn't depend on interest rates. Government spending doesn't depend on interest rates or inflation in general. Real government spending. When I say real, that means government spending not in today's dollar terms, but in constant dollar terms. And then exports, there would be a certain component that doesn't depend on interest rates, okay? So all those, when any of these factors change, these factors, the ones I've stated change, that would let's say if any of them went down, that would result in less aggregate demand at any interest rate, okay? That's why you have this shift in the curve, okay? Shifts in curves generally occur when an autonomous factor changes. Movements along a curve occur when this variable changes, okay? An endogenous variable changes. Okay. So this graph shows you when various autonomous factors change, and most of them are decreases in autonomous factors. There are a couple of them that are increases. And so, for example, when taxes increase, people have less money to spend. That would result, if taxes increase, that would result in a fall in aggregate demand. If little f, remember, is frictions in the export import sector, if there's frictions there, as they increase, that would result in a fall in demand. As the autonomous real rate of interest changes, okay? We discussed that last time. That would also result in a fall in aggregate demand. Okay, so that's how we would get a shift in the aggregate demand curve. Let me bring up the next slide. Whoops. Okay, so now I'm looking at figure 2 on page 519. And here we have the opposite effect going on. So starting at the blue curve, we have a shift to the right of the aggregate demand curve. And that's a result of the same autonomous factors changing, but in the opposite direction. So if government spending increases, we have a shift to the right of the aggregate demand curve. If taxes go down, that results in more disposable income, so consumption would increase. So we have a shift to the right of aggregate demand. Okay, so you could go through each of these. They're all explained in the text. And so that's how we would get a shift to the right of the aggregate demand curve. Okay? Very good. Let me stop there. Okay, so now we're ready to derive the supply side of the economy. This, I'm looking at page 521. Okay, so the aggregate supply side, remember it's composed of two curves. A long-run aggregate supply curve, which we show here, and a short-run aggregate supply curve, which is this curve. Okay, so what determines the shape and placement of the long-run aggregate supply curve? Okay, so people who have studied this have come to the conclusion that long-run aggregate supply is a function of three factors: the size of the labor force, the size of the capital stock, and that's not stock as in stock market, but physical capital, meaning factories, okay, intellectual stock, human knowledge, okay, actually physical capital. Let's leave it at that. So we've got labor, capital, and then the state of technology. So knowledge would actually go into technology. These are the three factors. As the population increases, labor would increase. Over time, as you build more factories, the capital stock increases in general. You could, because physical capital will deteriorate or depreciate unless you maintain that capital. We hear all about this all the time, infrastructure bill, whatever. You have to maintain it. And then over time, we've seen that, for example, the last, 30, 40 years, this tremendous increase in the use of computers, which falls into the category of an increase in technology, how important that is. And that's going to result in, over time, the supply curve will move to the right over time. But we're looking at things at a particular point in time. And so we would say that the potential output, YP, of the economy would be at a certain level. Okay, so when this book was written, you can see how old not this edition is not that old, but the book was written when potential output was $10 trillion. Now it's 20 or 22 trillion, okay? And it's a vertical line because potential output does not depend on inflation, okay? None of these factors here depend on the rate of inflation in the economy. So that's why the relationship between long-run aggregate supply and inflation is this vertical line. Whenever you get a vertical line or a horizontal line in a graph, that means that the relationship does not depend on one of the variables. Okay, that's a good thing to keep in mind. It only depends on one of the variables. Okay, so in this case, long-run aggregate supply, we could at any point in time would be a constant. And here the example is it's $10 trillion. Okay, and again, remember the proper units here is $1 trillion per year. Okay, this is a flow. $1 trillion per year. He's being a little sloppy here. Okay, the aggregate supply curve, and this is so important. At any point in time, we have a level of long-run aggregate supply, but in the short run, and the S here stands for short run, there is a relationship between output and inflation. Okay? And there's a really nice equation on page 522. It turns out that all of this stuff, instead of with graphs, it can be a little mysterious, but if you're able to do a little algebra, the equations are so much more straightforward. And so we have this equation here. And so what this says is inflation equals now expected inflation plus this is some constant times the difference between output and potential output. That's why with the superscript P is potential output. And this letter, it's a Greek letter rho, is a constant that, you know, it's there to take the place of various other factors. Okay. Now, or some equilibrium value of inflation. Well, let's say it's other factors. Okay, I would put it that way. Okay, so actually, these are, I really back up a second. Rho stands for inflation shocks. Okay. The other factors are inflation shocks. And what would be an example of that? An inflation shock would be an increase in oil prices, which was a huge problem again, back in the 70s and 80s, the OPEC, the Mideast countries at that time were supplying a large portion of U.S. oil, and they were operating as a cartel, and they met periodically and decided to increase the price of oil that they were selling to the U.S., and that caused, this inflationary shock. Okay, so one of the factors is this inflation shock. If that increases, inflation will increase. If output, this is current output, Y without a superscript. If output is greater than potential output, and how can output be greater than potential output? If the short run output, for example, if you're operating factories at a level that's unsustainable over the long run, that's one reason you could have real output be greater than potential output. If that is happening, we can imagine that that would result in inflation increasing. Okay. And one reason that contributes to inflation is that workers will demand higher wages. Okay. This is W for wages. Okay. Workers would demand higher wages. And firms would want to set higher prices. Okay. So if output is greater than potential output, we could see inflation increasing. And the big one now, this is really something that I'm sure nobody in the class, or I would be surprised if anybody in the class has thought about or heard about this factor. This is the big one that if you know something about this, you're really know more than most people who don't know economics. The big factor here is expectations of inflation. And again, going back to the 70s, people would, take the example of labor unions. They would be aware of the current inflation situation. They'd be aware of whether monetary policy was being set to reduce inflation or not. And they would set their labor contracts, demand labor contracts that would take into account their expectations of inflation. So if they expected inflation to increase, that would result in new wage contracts to have higher wages, and the expectation of inflation tomorrow would cause inflation today to increase. Okay, it's a little unusual, novel concept to grasp, but very important factor in economics. In particular, when I was in graduate school, a lot of the research in macroeconomics was in studying how expectations of inflation were created, were developed, were how they occurred. Okay, and so there would be various models of expectations of inflation, and it turned out that when you put this factor into your models of the economy, it would have a huge influence on your equilibrium solutions. Okay. So, given this equation here, you would say that there would be a certain rate of inflation. The rate of inflation today, let's say, you could associate that with today's output, and this is where you would be on your short run aggregate supply curve here. We just write it over here. And that would be equal to your long run potential output. So if you were at this point with this inflation rate and this output, you would be in equilibrium in the supply side of the economy, okay? And we're going to see when that's not true and what kind of adjustments would occur if, for example, the aggregate supply curve would be over here. You would, for this output, inflation would be higher than the equilibrium level. What would occur? Okay. So let's stop for a second. Okay, so now I'm looking at page 524, figure 4. So the first thing we're going to do in studying how the aggregate supply might change, we're going to look at what might happen here when you had either an increase in capital, labor, or technology, or what would happen. You obviously, if any of those factors increased, you would have an increase in the potential output, okay? And so you would have a shift to the right of the long-run average supply curve. And here, another factor that the text goes into is a fall in the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, natural rate of unemployment. So, we haven't talked about that yet. So, and there's an appendix to this chapter. I don't know if we're going to cover it, but what's involved in this factor is in an economy that's operating at quote unquote full employment, there's still going to be some unemployment, okay? And the reason there's several reasons why that's occurred. People are, even if the economy is humming along at optimal rate, there's still going to be people that want to change jobs. There's going to be certain businesses that are not doing well and that are going to close. Those people are going to lose their job and they're going to look for other jobs. There's various factors that are going to cause unemployment. And economists who have studied this over time have found that there's a certain rate that seems to be a constant across through time, and they've dubbed that the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, and if that were to fall, if, for example, it took, on average, people less time to find a new job than they used to, that would result in a fall in that source of unemployment, the natural rate of unemployment. And so if that occurred, people didn't have to spend as much time looking for a job in general. That would also be a factor in shifting the long-run average supply curve to the right. Okay, so that's how those four factors would shift the long-run average supply curve to the right. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to look at what factors can result in the short run supply curve to shift. Okay, so and this is but this is figure 5 on page 525, and here's in blue our initial aggregate supply curve, and the two shocks, or the two changes, autonomous changes that could occur would be a rise in expected inflation or a positive inflation shock. Okay, so if we're at potential output here and equilibrium, a sort of equilibrium inflation rate, if now people expected inflation to rise, as we discussed a little while ago, that would cause an increase in inflation today. So we would have a shift up at any level of output. Actual inflation would be higher. Or if we had a positive inflation shock, for example, an increase in oil prices, okay? We would also expect the supply curve to increase, okay? So again, we'd have an increase a shift up or to the left of the short run aggregate supply curve. Okay? Very good.